Hi everyone, welcome back to A Little More Inspired. My name is Blanca. If you haven't done so already, please be sure to hit the follow and subscribe button so that you never miss any of my new episodes. And if you haven't done so already, go check out my website, alittle.moreinspired.com, so that you can explore all of my content. So now we're going to enter more deeply into Mansion 1, but first we're going to describe what the outer areas of the castle are and what it's like to be there. I would say that modern culture and Mansion 1 are the same kind of energy. We are taught to focus almost entirely on the body and the external life. But Teresa reminds us that the body is not the diamond. The body is simply the setting. The soul is the diamond. So the structure of the castle. The castle has many mansions, and at the center of the castle is the principal chamber, where God and the soul share their most intimate communion. Think of this like diamond, and as you get to the center of the diamond, remember that commercial of the Tootsie Roll lollipop? It was like this bird, and it would be like, at the center of the Tootsie Roll, like that's where God is. At the center of the diamond is where God is. The castle has many layers. Not all rooms are equal. But the deeper you go into the castle, the closer you move towards God. Meaning the deeper you go into your soul, the closer you get to God's essence. The spiritual life is progressive. Not everyone is at the same depth, and that is okay. Not all of us are going to be in the same place spiritually. Because it is an internal experience. It is a one-on-one experience with God. We're all going to be in different stages. We're all going to be activated at different times in our life. For some people, it happens when you're young, and some people it happens when they're much older. The spiritual journey is not a competition. It's very important that we do not compare our spiritual path to anyone else's, or that we're like running to catch up to somebody, because each person's individual life is so different. And all of the things that they're coming with, the baggage, the things that they have to learn is very specific to their life. I think that it teaches not only the person that maybe is starting, but also the people who are really deep in their spiritual life, not judging people for not starting. It is really hard to start. So being compassionate with yourself and where you are, there is no end goal. The goal is to move inwardly. That is the goal, is that you are going more within. Most people live near the outer walls of the castle and never approach the center. It's very rare for people to even have the thought that there is something bigger out there than themselves. So yeah, what exists at the center of the castle is union with God, is contemplation, is deep interior communion. This is where the soul experiences its deepest intimacy with God. Teresa also addresses something important about things that happen to you as you progress spiritually. She describes God gifting spiritual gifts to the individual as they grow internally. She writes that even if we do not experience certain kinds of gifts for ourselves, we should always praise God for His goodness for giving them to others. Even if we do not receive them ourselves, we should always rejoice. And that you really shouldn't be going into the spiritual journey to receive gifts anyways. Sometimes the biggest gift is just having a humble heart and being able to shed a lot of the things that we hold on to very pridefully. Yes, there are people who have these really amazing experiences, but God does that to show His presence in the world. Teresa reminds us that sometimes God works through certain people simply to display His glory. For example, Jesus healed the blind man, not because of his sin, but to display the works of God. Sometimes God moves powerfully in someone else's life simply to reveal His power to others. So mystical gifts do not mean superiority. Sometimes I think that we have a tendency to pedestalize people who are teaching about spirituality or maybe have an understanding as if they're better than you. That they're not. St. Teresa is very clear about this. God's favors are not proof of superiority. It's very important that we start to look at things from a very rational place. Mystical experiences do not equal moral superiority. Spiritual visions do not mean higher rank. Extraordinary graces do not mean someone's holier than others. God gives these graces for different reasons. He gives them to manifest His greatness, to glorify Himself, and to awaken others spiritually. Everything that God does in us and in others has a bigger purpose. And God doesn't He doesn't rank people. This person is better than you. This person is less than you. I think a lot of the times people who try to manipulate others because they have an understanding of things, we allow ourselves to be manipulated by others by constantly trying to pedestalize people. So do not put God in a box. Teresa also warns us not to limit God. Just because we have not experienced something for ourselves does not mean God does not do it. We should not reduce God to our comfort level, shrink him to our theology, or dismiss the experiences of others simply because they are unfamiliar. Remaining open to God's freedom is an act of humility. So, what is the soul in the courtyard? So, Saint Teresa describes the mansion as like obviously the diamond being a castle, and like think of like a courtyard that's like this, right? A four square wall courtyard, and within that courtyard is the castle. So there's like an empty space within the walls. And then there are people who live outside of the courtyard. Those are people that are completely just totally asleep. They don't believe in God, totally disconnected from any thought of like having a soul. Where a lot of people are, which is they're in the courtyard, but they're not necessarily in the castle yet. She describes many people who remain in the courtyard of the castle as technically being inside the castle, but remain at the entrance or the exit. They have a soul, have been baptized, believe in God, but they have never actually gone inward. They have never had a moment of actual self reflection. The spiritual condition at this start of the mansion is that these are people who live lives that are distracted, surface level, reactive, and constantly busy. They rarely explore silence, self examination, or their interior depth. This is what St. Teresa describes as lukewarm spirituality or superficial spirituality, or just like the concept of understanding that you believe in God, but there has been no desire in the individual to learn more. She suggests that the condition describes the majority of Christians today. Without prayer, the soul is paralyzed. The book, The Interior Castle, is a book about growing in our prayer life. So Teresa used a strong image about this. Without prayer, the soul becomes paralyzed. Prayer is movement. Without prayer, the soul cannot walk inward. The soul cannot withdraw into the heart. The soul becomes spiritually weak. Prayer is not simply reciting words. Prayer is communion, conscious participation with God, and awareness of who we are speaking to. So it is important, like for something to be considered prayer, you have to know who you're praying to. You have to know what you're seeking every time that you go within and within silence. I think that obviously meditation is important and like learning to quiet the mind, but with deeper spiritual prayer, meditation has a purpose, which is to connect to God and not just like, relax our nervous system. When we are not connected to anything and we aren't seeking a spiritual life and we are totally immersed in the distractions of the world, we start becoming like the creatures outside of the castle. Teresa uses a strange but powerful image. She describes some of the souls outside of the castle as being like rodents. The soul spends so much time outside of itself, being so disconnected from their interior life that they begin to resemble the creatures that live there. What this means spiritually is simple. We become what we dwell among. You become what you focus on. If what you put on a pedestal is money, then you're going to become somebody who that's what they're constantly seeking. If you become somebody who pedestalizes popularity, then you will become a popular person in the world, and that is what's going to be what feeds you. If you become somebody who pedestalizes material things, you're going to become a materialist. But when we are looking towards God, we will naturally become more like him. But if we constantly dwell in things of the world, in gossip, in comparison, in vanity, in anger, in noise, constant worldly stimulation, then our interior life will begin to shrink and we will become more of that. We were created for communion with God, but our environment begins to shape our soul. This teaching is not meant to shame us. It is meant to help us recognize where spiritual alignment is or isn't. Gate to the first mansion is prayer. How you get through the first mansion, how you begin to become more self aware, is through a deep desire to change. I think that for me, when I began my spiritual journey, it was after I had had like a really deep rock bottom. I had consistently lived years with depressive episodes, with anxiety, with drama. There was so much chaos in my life all the time. Like I feel like I wouldn't go a single day without something happening to me. And I remember getting to like this like place where I felt so empty. And I remember thinking, like, I don't want to live my life like this. Like I hate it here. And in that desperation, I began to pray. Obviously, I grew up Catholic, and at that time, like I lived my life for the weekends, having fun, and I really wasn't seeking anything deeper than what my everyday life was like. I would find myself in these depressive episodes, and in my desperation, I was like, if there's anything out there, please help me. And I want to change, and I got to a place where like I truly meant it. And then I feel like that door cracked open. So, and I think that that's the truth, that that's how it happens for a lot of people. It is slow, and it is you as an individual choosing to be different. Who are the people in the first mansion? The people in the first mansion believe in God, have some awareness of God, and want to do the right thing. They often are good, decent people, but they are still simply immersed in the world. Their concerns revolve around worldly things. And that's not to shame you. It's a reality of what it is before you begin. A lot of things crash and burn before you actually really begin to see the fruits of your efforts. So the attachments of Mansion 1. So the person's primary investments tend to be career, image, relationships, money, comfort, social life, anxieties about daily life. They may pray occasionally, usually when they feel afraid or when something goes wrong. For like me deciding that I wanted to change. Like I think I only ever went to God when like I was going through something. And then when everything would get good, I wouldn't talk to God and I wouldn't thank him for getting me out of my rock bottoms. I would only go to church, when I was with my family. I only really thought about myself and what it is that I wanted to experience. There wasn't a single thought of like going to God like on my good days. The first grace. This is when you realize that something is missing. The first grace is the spiritual life activating. It is the soul activating itself. It is realizing that something is wrong. Teresa describes this moment as the realization that you will not reach your designed goal by continuing down the path you're currently in. Like, I feel like if I would have continued on the path that I was in before my spiritual awakening, I don't really know what kind of person I would have been. I feel like I would still have been in a lot of chaos, and I think I would have made a lot of really bad decisions for myself. And I would have gotten myself stuck in situations that I don't know if I would have necessarily made any progress eventually. Or maybe I wouldn't be well, like mentally. Sometimes this realization comes through suffering, disappointment, rock bottom moments, a persistent feeling that something is missing. The spiritual awakening, the first mansion, does not begin with holiness. It begins with discomfort. People start noticing that success does not satisfy, distractions no longer numb the emptiness that they feel, that something deeper is calling them. There is this feeling of discomfort, this feeling of like something happening within them that they can't quite understand. Some people run away from those things. They distract themselves. They party. They drink. They get lost in relationships. They jump from person to person. They sleep around. They do anything that they can to keep themselves from feeling that discomfort. I think that a lot of people numb themselves sometimes when you're going through a rock bottom and everyone abandons you, I think that sometimes I realize now that that's the best place to be in sometimes. Because when you have nothing else, the only thing that is left is you and God and not picking you up. That recognition itself is grace. People begin thinking, this cannot be all there is. That moment is when the door to the castle begins to open. We've talked about being outside the courtyard. Then you enter the castle by entering the courtyard, which is where most of us are, that believe in God, that have been baptized, that have. And then that push of like that true awakening where that rock bottom has finally pushed you to think about things deeper. The door finally opens. But with like anything, like have you guys ever watched Game of Thrones when the wall, the monsters, the ice white people are coming? Oh, no pun intended. They're trying to get over the wall. Like when we enter the castle, we are also coming with these like creatures and these thoughts. And we're not coming into the castle alone. Like basically it's like you've been in a storm and you're like damped with mud and water and rain and you're like finally in shelter. But you have all of this baggage. And when someone first enters the castle, you're not entering alone. You've entered accompanied by vermin or by baggage. This vermin represents the baggage the soul carries. This includes distorted attachments, our pride, our envy, our lust, our anger, our resentment, our vanity, our habitual sin, our fears, our ego defenses. The soul is inside the castle but is still standing near the basement entrance. So basically, you've just entered the door, but the old life is still very much on you. After you've had really big sense of clarity, I feel like sometimes you think like, oh my God, like I've already done all the healing, but you realize that even though mentally you've had this moment of clarity, your body is still very much attached and reacting to who you've been. And there's a lot of like catching up that you have to do physically, mentally, spiritually to finally like be at the place of that sense of clarity that you've had. And that really it's just the beginning of like a healing journey. So that's why the early spiritual life is actually really messy. It is not easy. Getting through that first door, I'm so glad that I'm not there anymore because that was like a really hard period in my life. Because you've come to this understanding of yourself and there's something being more magnificent out there to strive for. But your view and like the goggles have been cleaned, but your view is still technically like obstructed. This is why early spiritual life feels so messy. Like you feel like you're kind of going crazy and you are just going through it, you know, like you're going through a lot at the beginning of your spiritual journey. It is not easy. But the most important thing is that you want something bigger than yourself. You want God, but you still struggle, you fall, you feel chaotic, and you feel deeply distracted. This stage is confusing, but it is normal. What you're going through in this stage of your spiritual growth, where you're feeling like you're going crazy, like everything's falling apart, this is normal. And you will get through this storm because that's what it feels like. It feels like a storm. This part of entering is already such a big accomplishment. The fact that you've had this moment of clarity, like you have to thank God for giving it to you. And even though the road right after this really beautiful moment is really difficult, I just want you to know how proud of yourself you should be of being in this place and that you will get through this storm and that things will get easier as you really begin to change and focus on your interior life. For me, God completely isolated me. I spent almost like a year alone, like by myself, where I was just reading books. I couldn't stop reading because like all of this clarity was like coming up, understanding things in a way that I never had before. So you should know that most people never attempt at it. Entering the castle itself is God's grace. and recognizing that you need more is already movement towards God. He is so happy that you're even trying. If you're just starting, it's just like to keep going, and it's going to be worth it in the end. And sometimes it takes years, but what a wonderful thing that you've experienced if you finally have left the courtyard and opened that door to God's grace. So in Mansion 1, St. Teresa calls this spiritually split people. Mansion 1 describes people who are spiritually divided. They feel torn between God and the world, and they're kind of like this. You're still so accustomed to the world and to expectations of the world. God has put me in many seasons where He's had me shed friendships and moved me completely away from different places because that's what was necessary for my journey. You know, everybody is so different, but really it's because God is trying to like pull you closer to Him and really help you see like, from a different perspective. I wanted to talk about what sin is because I think that that's an important concept to understand before we dive deeper into Mansion 1 and before we talk about like some of the obstacles that the person will experience as they choose to grow spiritually. I think that it's just helpful to define what sin is. And I personally, the word sin has always been a word that makes me kind of uncomfortable, and I'm sure it makes other people feel uncomfortable. And honestly, that discomfort is like understandable. Throughout history, the concept of sin has sometimes been misused and manipulated by institutions and individuals to control people through shame, fear, and moral intimidation. But if you really learn what sin really means, you know, like I was thinking the other day, I used to go to Sunday school when I was younger, and we did our first communion and like we did our confirmation. And I kind of wish that I could do those things again, or like I could go to Sunday school again now that I'm an adult. Now that I understand the importance of like first communion and confirmation, I don't think that I was emotionally or mentally mature for those experiences when I was like a kid. Like I wish they could do that now, like a read of those things now that I'm an adult. Understand the moment just so much more because a lot of us are also growing up with spiritually dry parents. And I think that we all grow up with these like concepts of the religion and like they're not like an accurate view of what it actually means or like actually helping us. I think that it actually creates all this shame, and then that's why so many people run away from religion because we don't really understand it. Because of that, many modern listeners immediately react negatively when they hear the word sin. They're like, ugh, I don't want to hear this. Like, you know, like I think that I was talking to this friend who grew up in a religious Baptist family. She's not religious anymore, and I was like trying to understand like why, and she was saying that for so long her family had used like ideas of purity culture and all of these rules to like shame her for her curiosities or for her questions. But then when she went onto the world and she did the things that her parents had told her not to do, nothing bad happened. Sometimes when people are trying to be helpful in their spirituality, they do a lot of fear mongering to get Christians or young kids to like do the right thing. And I think that in that desire to try to scare us into don't do this and that because this will lead to this and that, I don't think that that actually teaches us anything. I think that a lot of kids are going to end up being more curious about what those things are that they're fear mongering us about because, like my friend said, when she went out to do those things, nothing bad happened. But it's really over time, your distraction of you doing things that don't necessarily start off bad is like the accumulation of that distraction is what actually leads you to eventually be completely disconnected, not actually like the act itself. Sin really means is choosing something that moves us away from love of God, from love of others, or the good we were actually made for. I'm going to be using the word sin a lot in this series. And when I'm using it, that's what I mean. When we choose things and we're making conscious choices that are moving us away from love. And sometimes we're not even doing it consciously. So, what is a venial sin? A venial sin means light or lesser sin. And this really is the things that we do when we're unconscious, when we're deeply asleep. It gradually damages your connection to God, it weakens charity, it clouds spiritual clarity, and it makes the soul spiritually sluggish. But it does not cut you off completely from God. The soul is still alive in grace. So when we are in venial sin, we're doing things unconsciously. We are selfish, but there's like a normalization in the culture of being that way. It means that we're doing things from an unconscious place, either through our wounding, either through our ignorance. Somebody who's genuinely good would become aware that they're doing something that's harmful. That person would change it if they're aware of it. Teresa's image for venial sin, think of this venial sin as a dusty crystal. Like you still have the diamond, but it hasn't been like polished. There's like a gray shadow over it, or like, when like there's like a window that hasn't been wiped, like it's full of dust. So the diamond is still there, the light still shines, the person, still has like goodness in them, but the brilliance of the diamond has been dimmed. So examples of venial sin are impatience with others, gossip, minor dishonesties, vanity, small resentments, selfish thoughts, or chaos. These things weaken the interior life but do not sever the relationship with God. Most people focus on like the mortal sins and like scaring you of like mortal sin things, but really, like, what we have to pay attention to is the things that we're doing in ignorance, the things that we have normalized in our everyday life. Because, like, if you start to fearmonger me, I'm not somebody that learns spirituality that way. You putting fear in me doesn't necessarily make me want to go learn about God more. Learning about sin properly from like a more rational place rather than from this like doomsday place could be helpful to a lot more people when you think about it from a place of like growth. So venial sin often looks like thoughts such as, I know I shouldn't react this way, but I keep doing it. You feel yourself doing something habitually and you don't know why you can't stop it. It can appear as small ego habits, spiritual laziness, or attachments that create chaos in a person's life. Moving out of this state requires self-reflection, growth, a greater awareness. It requires a heart that genuinely wants to do better and grow spiritually. For us to move out of venial sin and out of doing these things unconsciously is just through intentional self-work, through learning about ourselves, self-reflecting, sitting with God on our own, praying, reading. How we move out of venial sin is just it's living in a state of ignorance. And you have to be seeking out knowledge. You have to be seeking out God's grace and God's wisdom, and He will help you, and you will start to see yourself grow and change. And when you know that you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing, it isn't necessarily like that fear mongering that people do. You just start to be more aware, oh, I don't want to feel that way, or I don't want to hurt anybody, or I don't want to feel what it's like for God to go silent on me. Because I think that when you have like a really dusty diamond, like I call it that, it's like God going silent on you, and like you feel really disconnected from Him, and like nothing good feels like it's happening in your life because of the choices that you've been making that have been keeping you away from God's grace. Yeah, that's what venial sin is. And then there is mortal sin. This is the one I feel like most religious people are always talking about mortal sin, and so they make venial sin into mortal sin. And it's not the same. Mortal sin means deadly sin. And it is called deadly because it kills the life of grace in the soul. For a sin to be mortal, three conditions must be present. Number one, the matter must be grave. It is a grave matter. The act itself is serious. And I think that you can look at like the Ten Commandments to know like what things are like really serious. It's something where you're doing something that's like really bad. Number two, you have full knowledge about it and you know in your heart that what you're doing is bad. The person knows the act is wrong. Number three, it is deliberate consent. The person is freely choosing it. So for something to be mortal sin, if one of these conditions is missing, it is not considered mortal sin. It is a venial sin. So a mortal sin has to be a grave matter, you have to have full knowledge of it, and you have to have deliberate consent. That is mortal sin. Mortal sin severs union with God, removes sanctifying grace from your life, and darkens the intellect, will, and heart. Teresa describes this with powerful imagery. A mortal sin is like a thick black cloth covering the diamond, completely blacking out any light. That is what the person living in mortal sin's soul is like. The castle is still there, the diamond is still precious, but the light can no longer shine through clearly. So, the effect on the soul that mortal sin has on the individual, it breaks love and rejects a relationship with God completely. It leaves the soul spiritually darkened. So, to move out of this state, it requires genuine repentance, understanding of the gravity of one's action, and a sincere spiritual conversion, a sacramental reconciliation. You may not always be able to control how other people respond to your actions, but you can choose to grow, change, and live differently and walk with humility. I'm sure that there's been people who have done things, and I don't want anybody to think that they can't move out of this energy or they can't move out of this state of being or that you're not redeemable. We are all redeemable in God's eyes. I think that it's important to know that as a human being, we are all deeply, deeply flawed. And and that we all come with things and baggages, and sometimes that creates us from hardening our hearts. And sometimes when we've hardened our heart because of either the experiences that we've gone through or the hurts that we've experienced, it can turn us into a person that has no grace in them. We don't extend grace to others, and we can do things that can be quite calculating or harmful to ourselves and to others. But even if you've done those things, if there's a deeper part of you where a light has been able to peek through and show you that you can change and that you are able to grow from that state of mind, you are redeemable. If there's anybody out there who like has ever felt like they're not a redeemable person, like maybe you've done things that you aren't proud of, that doesn't mean that you're not forgivable and that you're not allowed to seek God's grace, and God is always waiting for your heart to change. So yeah. So it's important to clarify that mortal sin does not mean that God has stopped loving you, that you lose your dignity, that you become worthless, that you are rejected forever. It means that you have chosen to live in darkness for a time. But the possibility to return always remains. The soul is never beyond redemption. So why good works do not count in mortal sin. So Teresa says something that can be a little bit confusing. She explains that when the soul is in mortal sin, God works do not produce spiritual fruit. This does not mean that a person cannot do good things. It means that good actions are disconnected from union with God. So she uses the image of a tree. A tree may try to produce fruit, may try to do good, but it like constantly kind of fails. Like anything good that it tries doesn't necessarily bear anything good out of it. The fruit cannot fully flourish. Anything good that we try to do doesn't ever really sprout any growth. It always hits like a brick wall. So when we're doing things that are in mortal sin, even when we try to change, we keep finding these like blocks that don't allow us to or to grow in the direction that we necessarily want. So the image of the living river, when the soul is living in grace, when we are actively trying to grow spiritually, when we're trying to change, when we're trying to have a real relationship with God, it is like a tree planted beside living waters. It naturally produces good fruit. Grace nourishes the soul the way that water nourishes a tree. The person, beams with light. When we become spiritually blind, the intellect begins to rationalize our actions. We begin to rationalize why the things that we do aren't that bad. The will weakens. For example, like you want to be faithful, like in hindsight, you want to be faithful towards a new hobby, your relationship, like your goals, but your will isn't able to sustain itself for very long. Like you slowly slip back to your old ways. So for you to actually change and to grow out of your addictions, you have to be connected to God, and he will help your will by making you spiritually strong, by being able to walk away from things that aren't good for you. Like you're doing things from a place of conviction. When you're living in sin, emotions begin to rule our decisions, right? We're impulsive, we're not rational, we're doing everything from feelings that we get. The faculties of the soul become disordered and judgment becomes clouded. We begin to justify our own actions instead of seeing things clearly. We're seeing things from a distorted place. So, two lessons Teresa learned. Lesson number one is a need to have a fear for displeasing God. And I feel like a lot of people say that, right? Like you have to have a fear of God. And we begin to fear being punished by God. But God doesn't really punish us. It's a fear of wounding love, right? That's what we need to see, is that when we're doing things that we're not supposed to, we are wounding our connection to love, our connection to our heart, our connection to our soul. She feared damaging her relationship with God, not God punishing her. She feared God going silent on her because if she would succumb to bad decisions that were not good for her life, then that would disconnect her from the light that she has within herself. And so when she says the number one lesson is fear of displeasing God, it doesn't come from a place of fear or punishment. It comes from a place of damaging your relationship with God. She prayed constantly that she would never do anything to harm that connection. And I think that that's how I know that I'm growing spiritually different now, is that now, once you feel that feeling of being truly connected to God, there's like no feeling like it. How I've discovered it most heightened has been through adoration. It's just this feeling that you get that you are totally connected to something bigger than yourself. And when you know what it feels like to not have that, you will understand why you don't want to do anything to sever that feeling. And not even a feeling, that knowing. I don't even know how to explain it. The second lesson that she learns is that she reiterates throughout this chapter is humility. Teresa realized that no goodness within us originates from ourselves. Every good action comes from God's grace, the life-giving river, the light of the sun. So even when we act generously, kindly, or patiently, it is God working through us. That realization destroys your pride. I think that a lot of the times people like to think like they're a good person, and I feel like I'm always striving to be a good person. I always ask God to help me be good. I want to be good. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that comes natural to me, or that I can always do that consistently, because I can have my attitudes and I can have my reactions that sometimes feel out of my control. But when you realize that a lot of the goodness that you're doing is God working through you, those moments of inspiration where you're kind or you are patient in a situation that usually would cause you to be irritated, those moments, becoming aware of those really special moments and giving thanks to God that He's allowed you to react in that way. When you notice something good in yourself, responding with kindness, showing patience, choosing generosity, turn to God as the source and give Him thanks. Recognize that He has inspired the good within you. that is mature humility, because you cannot understand sin unless you understand what you're losing. If you don't know that you're a diamond, that there is a diamond within you, you won't care if it's dark, or to clear it or to polish it into what you could become. So yeah, I think that this is where I'm going to end episode 1. I really think that this is a good start to understand what it means to begin the spiritual walk. And then in the next episode, I will go into the 4 types of soils once the person is fully in Mansion 1, and some of the obstacles that the person will face as they choose to grow spiritually. Saint Teresa of Ávila just does such a good job at describing in great detail spiritual progress. I just find her to be such a fascinating saint, and I'm very grateful that she has come into my life. And I hope that you guys feel inspired to read the book, Saint Teresa of Ávila, The Interior Castle, a modern translation. I'm excited for the next episode, and I hope that this made sense and that you leave feeling a little more inspired. And yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Bye.